Initially ominously leaked under the working title Project Beast, Bloodborne is a PS4 exclusive dark fantasy action RPG from the creators of the beloved Dark Souls series. It released in March of 2015 and moved away from the more dark medieval fantasy from Dark Souls that FromSoft was known for, and instead gazed in the direction of prominent horror authors like Edgar Allan Poe, H.P. Lovecraft, and Mary Shelley. Adopting a more aggressive and fast-paced combat system than previous Souls games, Bloodborne is famous for the rally mechanic where, upon being hit, the player can quickly hit back in time to regain their lost health. In response to this amped up combat speed, the clothing design is notably lighter than that of other Souls titles and are mostly constructed of cloth and leather in comparison to the usually heavy armored sets of previous titles. Sometimes video games put us in the position to answer some of life's most difficult questions. Like, what sort of fashion would you put on eldritch monstrosities of cosmic indifference? This is the exact question that I imagine goes through all the minds of the developers at FromSoft whenever they are designing a new game. The long coats and flowy capes of Yharnam's inhabitants were not only a showcase of the PS4's software, but also pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible in video game clothing at the time. Its deep, thoughtful lore and purposeful design has left Bloodborne remembered not only as a video game, but a work of art. And today, we're gonna take a look at the uncaringly harsh Victorian world of Yharnam and discuss what sort of fashion is worn by those who are left to deal with matters in whatever way they deem fit. And maybe even along the way, think about what lens you would go in the pursuit of higher knowledge. I'd like to quickly mention that I am not going to be going over every unique hunter set just because so many outfits that you can have in-game are actually just those that are picked up off of many of the characters we will also be discussing today. And before we begin, I just want to mention that I am going to be taking a look at all the designs on my side screen over here while we talk about them. In almost every conversation discussing the fashion design of Bloodborne, the film Brotherhood of the Wolf is brought up almost every time. This film, Brotherhood of the Wolf, is popularly cited within the fan community as one of the largest influences on Miyazaki when thinking about the art direction of Bloodborne. When I actually looked for some sources to confirm this information, I could only find one interview where Miyazaki has mentioned this movie with GameStop Brazil in 2019, but it unfortunately seems that the original interview has been lost to time. The one thing that I found was a post by this banned user on resetera.com who translated the supposed article from Portuguese to English and found the question that gave us this information. GameSpot asked, "What were your inspirations when you first conceived Bloodborne?" And Miyazaki answered simply with, "I was inspired by Lovecraft's book, The Call of Cthulhu. Anyone who played the game will likely know that I was heavily influenced by Lovecraft and his works. Other sources of inspiration were horror, of course, and the film Brotherhood of the Wolf." To my knowledge, this is the only source that we have of this film being mentioned by Miyazaki, but I do believe that it was a massive inspiration for him. Brotherhood of the Wolf is a French historical action horror film from 2001 that is loosely based around a series of real-life murders that took place in France in the 18th century and the famous myth of the Beast of Gévaudan. The Beast of Gévaudan was a large wolf-like man-eating creature that terrorized this province of France between the years of 1764 and 1767. While the general premise of the movie is quite similar to that of Bloodborne already, i.e. there is a vaguely European setting with beasts terrorizing it and these cool hunter guys going around fighting the evil forces with cool weapons and hand-to-hand combat. But if we actually take a look at the costume design in the movie, there is an undeniable connection there. Keep this film in mind throughout the video today because I will be referencing it when discussing relevant character designs. Just coming off directly from Brotherhood of the Wolf, the first character that we're going to be discussing today is the player character, the Hunter. Similarly to the designs that we see in Brotherhood of the Wolf, we see distressed tricorn hats, highwayman-esque trench coats with pelerine-styled capelets, and face coverings in the hunter's garb. I have noticed a little bit of confusion on online discussions when it comes to the style of jacket worn by the hunters, so I hope to clear this up today. So the obvious base of this design is, of course, a long trench coat. The trench coat, as its name suggests, was developed out of heavy heavy-duty waterproof material, usually wool, for the British Army officers during the First World War to protect them in the trenches. Predating this, though, is the style of jacket worn by highwaymen. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, the lack of decent roads in England made travel very dangerous, and there was a very real fear of being robbed at any moment. Highwaymen were armed assailants traveling along popular highways looking for any unassuming and underprepared travelers. Common depictions of these thieves show them with cocked hats, face coverings, capes, and long frock coats that truly do resemble the later trench coat style. The style of jackets worn in Bloodborne is a little bit more trim and fitted than a traditional trench coat, and is a bit more similar to frock coats and waistcoats of the earlier Georgian and Victorian eras. And then on top of this jacket is a sort of cropped cape or capelet that feels very similar to the pelerine, which was originally clergy wear, but then was developed into a unisex fashion cape. In my opinion, as compared to the trench coat or the frock coats of highwaymen, the addition of this pelerine on the hunter's coat is a tad bit more reminiscent of Victorian era greatcoats or carrick coats. So the greatcoat was incredibly similar to trench coats, except usually they were made out of a thicker, more outerwear kind of material, like a winter coat. But today I want to really focus in on the carrick style of greatcoat specifically. This style has gone by many names, more than I can remember. Carrick, garrick, box coat, driving coat, coachman's coat, levitt, phaeton coat, Iverness, or even the Ulster coat. And all of these different names are describing essentially the exact same style of coat with a short cape covering the shoulders for both style and utility purposes. This style of Victorian coat is where I believe that the hunter's coat drew inspiration from. And then if we take a little bit of a closer look, we'll see that both the female and male coats are vented and have slits that promote agility and align with the game's gameplay style. The three-pointed style of hat worn by Bloodborne's various hunters is a tricorn hat, or as they called it throughout the 18th century, the cocked hat. The tricorn was popular both for its fashion and its practicality. It was first developed by soldiers who turned up the brims of their wide hats out of the way of their muskets and to provide rain and sun protection. And then over time, it became popular to decorate these brims with lace, feathers, and braids as a status signifier. Other than this, the clothing underneath the hunter's cloak feels pretty standard to the Victorian era, with a pair of fitted trousers, a seemingly linen or cotton white undershirt, and a sort of leathered waistcoat vest. We will now be moving on from the player hunter and talking about the first hunter, Germán. So Germán's entire design is basically entirely consisting of fabrics and leathers, and not a whole lot of metal. This is something that we will notice in many of the designs in Bloodborne. As compared to the knights who earlier attempted to control the beastly problem plaguing Yharnam, the first hunters introduced and popularized cloth and leather attire as compared to the heavy mail and armor. In various dungeons, we can even see the armored remains of the fallen knights. Germán's design echoes that of the player character hunter, so most of the pieces I discussed there also carry over here. Just as a small addition and another possible historical influence, we can take a look at the costumes of late 1600s French infantry and militiamen. Their military costume often consisted of sleek leather boots, brimmed hats that were often adorned and three-cornered, knee-length coats, and neck scarves, which is very similar to Germán. And then the design that we have for Germán from when he was an active hunter himself is about the same as we see him in the Hunter's Dream, except his hat is just a bit taller and less deflated, and his coat and capelet are at their full length, but they are still heavily tattered and shredded, just not as much. Compared to the player hunter character with the addition of a tall top hat, Germán feels even more gritty and Victorian, like a Dickensian character. Next up is retired hunter Jura. I don't have too much to say about Jura. He's wearing the Ashen Hunter set, and as explained in the item description, it is doused with ash to ward off blood. This is the specific attire worn by the Powder Keg Hunters, and it is structurally very similar to that of the base Hunter set and shares many of the same influences. It is, of course, just a bit more dirtied, ashen, and tattered. Another one of the designs that shares many of the same influences as the designs we've previously talked about already is that of Father Gascoigne. Father Gascoigne is dressed quite similarly to the player character's hunter garb, and it's a bit like a mix between the player character and Grimond's more fabric-based design. He doesn't wear the typical tricorn styled hat seen on most of the other hunters, and instead has a wide-brimmed hat similar to that of Grimond's. Gascoigne is said to be a foreigner in Yharnam, and I think we can see a little bit of this through his character design too. Compared to most other characters wearing clothing that we can assume is native to Yharnam, Gascoigne's garb is much less tailored and slim-fitting, opting for a more loose and flowy drapery in his pieces. Of course, this is not some like huge major detail, but I did notice that throughout looking at all the characters for this video, that he is actually interestingly one of the only characters to really be wearing baggier clothing. Our next character is Old Hunter Henrik. Henrik's clothing is quite similar to that of the Yharnam Hunters set, except it is in this yellowy tan instead, and is mostly constructed of different types of leathers instead of fabrics, which is interestingly noted as being resistant to electricity. In general, this is a really fun and flamboyant layered design. He appears to be wearing chaps over his pants, and they have these cool buckled strap details on the thighs. And then the long feather in his hat adds a little bit of like a French, Italian, Spanish flamboyance to his design. Historically, a feathered hat was a big fashion statement and represented achievement and a little bit of a flair and personality. The layering in this design adds a little bit of like kookiness to it that I think is really interesting and definitely sets it apart in vibes from the other hunter sets. Our next character is Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower. So Lady Maria basically recirculates many of the same design choices of the other hunter characters, but in a much more refined and elegant way. Besides the tattering at the edges and her bloodied cravat, Maria's clothing is very clean and well kept, which is unlike most of the other hunters. Maria wears the Maria Hunter set, and the item descriptions reveal that her garb was crafted in Cainhurst and that she is a distant relative of their queen. And if we take a look at the male Cainhurst knight set, we can see a lot of stylistic similarities between the two designs. Just as a little bit of a comparison, the female Cainhurst knight set consists of a dress that kind of brings up imagery of a mix between the constructed women's wear of the late 1700s, mixed with the lavishly ornate nature of wealthy queens of Portugal, Italy, and England. And then back to the male set, which is similar to Maria, is mostly constructed of ornately decorated fabric and shares similar golden embroidery, cravat, and large gemstone brooch. A notable detail that the female set has that the male set lacks is a head accessory of a few sparse feathers, and in Maria's tricorn hat, she has a couple white feathers tucked in. I think this was an interesting way to tie together the influences from both the female and male Cainhurst knight sets. We just discussed this with Henrik a little while ago, but a feathered hat was historically a pretty common accessory across Europe, and it often represented wealth, valor, extravagance, and often a little bit ostentatious of the wearer. Quite notably, both Maria's hunter set and the Cainhurst knight set feel largely inspired by French military uniform. If we take a look at some of the military costume from the mid to late 1600s, we see a lot of the same design elements. Long coats with decorated hems, large fold detailing on the forearms, feathered black brimmed hats, leather shoes, high collars, and commonly diagonal crossed sashes and belts. And then probably the more decorated features of her design are drawing from European gentlemen of the same era. The floral brocade fabric of her jacket and vest with the ornately embroidered ribboning is definitely something we could see on any French, English, or Dutch gentleman, as well as a stately cravat. The cravat, also known as an ascot, or maybe the slightly more ornate version called a jabot in France, was a sort of necktie worn by wealthy individuals. An 1828 guidebook titled The Art of Tying the Cravat, demonstrated in 16 lessons by author H. Leblanc, writes, "In 1660, a regiment of Croats arrived in France. A part of their singular costume excited the greatest admiration and was immediately and generally imitated. This was a tour de cou, made for the private soldiers of common lace and of muslin or silk for the officers. The ends were arranged en rosette or ornamented with a button or tuft, which hung gracefully on the breast. This new arrangement, which confined the throat but very slightly, was at first termed a croat, since corrupted to cravat. The cravats of the officers and people of rank were extremely fine, and the ends were embroidered or trimmed with broad lace. Those for the lower classes were subsequently made of cloth or cotton, or, at the best, of black taffeta, plaited, which was tied round the neck by 2 small strings. Based on these influences, we can deduce that Lady Maria's garb is both tactical and a big status symbol. The next design we're going to be discussing is that of Alfred, Hunter of Vilebloods. Alfred is wearing the executioner's garb set, and it is basically his mission to kill all the Vilebloods, which is basically Bloodborne's equivalent to vampires. The structure of this design really mirrors that of upper, middle, and upper class gentlemen in 16th century Italy. Alfred's lower garments appear to be Venetians, which were a style of knee-length breeches, paired with some style of jerkin underneath a long caped cloak with sleeves. The cinching silhouette at the waist and high collar is also very indicative of this era's clothing style. Italian fashion during the 15th century was markedly influenced by Spain, France, and Germany, so we can see similar styles in these countries as well. I truly believe that the entire construction of this design heavily mirrors that of 15th and 16th century gentlemen. This is definitely a construction that you would see on any wealthy merchant or maybe a man active in politics or even maybe just one that is independently wealthy. It makes a lot of sense that Alfred is dressed in this way since he is part of the Healing Church and they are quite well off and well respected in their society. Our next design is that of Lady Ariana. Although Ariana is introduced to us as a courtesan of the night, she is wearing a noble dress that can be found within the walls of Canehurst Castle, the home of the Vilebloods. From this, we can maybe infer that she or maybe one of her parents survived the Vileblood genocide and found their way to Yarnum somehow. We don't really know much about Ariana. The style of the noble dress is quite reminiscent of late Renaissance and 18th century French and Venetian gowns, such as the robe à la Française style gown. Although this dress in particular seems to be missing a chemise or petticoat underneath, which would provide the characteristic puffiness usually seen with this gown style. Because it is missing this underlayer to provide its structure, the deflated nature of this dress has a little bit more of like a medieval vibe, but the neckline and sleeves are undeniably Renaissance style. More decorated versions of this dress, specifically with the sleeves, can be seen on Spanish queens in the 1520s and 30s, and specifically on this example of a depiction of Diane de Poitiers, mistress of Henry II. This very non-decorated and more plain style of sleeves that we see on Ariana's noble dress is something that we can see on Italian courtesans of this time period. And with that, we will now be moving on to Queen Annalise of the Vilebloods. Compared to the fashion of Ariana, or even the doll who we will be looking at shortly, who pull inspiration from the fashion styles of mid-1800s Victorian era, Queen Annalise is dressed more in a Regency style dress from the early 1800s. Using real-world fashion trends as a base and their own timelines, we can get some interesting implications about the timeline of Ariana's imprisonment, as Ariana is dressed in a kind of bygone era compared to the other female characters in Bloodborne. Regency gowns are some of the only in this time period to have been worn with thin petticoats or none at all, giving them this characteristic tight-fitting silhouette. Also, short sleeve dresses were only really worn during the Regency era and were never really common with other styles of gowns in other eras. Other than a Regency gown, you could also say that Annalise might appear to be wearing just a chemise or some sort of undergarment or underdress, maybe even a nightgown. If we were to say that this is a chemise, there would also be a petticoat underneath this to provide the outer dress with some kind of body, and then there would be an outer corset and a bodice jacket with long sleeves on top. On her head, Queen Annalise is wearing a helmet that resembles the Canehurst helmet, which is made of silver and said to repel ill intent. This alternate version worn by Queen Annalise includes a ornately bordered green ribbon covering her eyes. Real-world European mythology and folklore views iron and silvered metals as a repellent for evil spirits, making this a really interesting choice for a vampiric character to be wearing. Queen Annalise is quite a mysterious character that we never really get to learn much about, but I think that there is a lot that we can infer about her just based on the clothing they chose to design her in. Our next character to discuss today is the doll. From the doll's description, we can read, a discarded doll, likely a spare for dress up. She shows the signs of fine craftsmanship and she is kept with care. She is definitely the cleanest character in the game. We learn about the creation of the doll by Grimaud's hands, who possessed very strong emotions towards Lady Maria and created the doll in her image. There's a really interesting dichotomy between Lady Maria's more masculine gear set matching that of the male Canehurst set compared to the doll's more traditionally feminine wear. So the hat on the doll's head is a bonnet, which was very popular and probably the most common headdress of Victorian women. In the earlier years of the 19th century, bonnets were quite plain and had larger brims to protect women from the sun, since pale skin was used as a status signifier at the time. As a product of the popularization of industrial production throughout the mid to late 1800s, bonnet brims became more commonly decorated and shorter, and this is most similar to the style we see on the doll. An article written by Darna Michie from East Angel Harbor Hat Shop states, in 1837, a lady's bonnet was carefully chosen to reflect refinement and virtue. Wide brims shaded fair complexions, while embellishments showed artistic craftsmanship. Attending a social meant more than mingling. It was a display of fashion sensibilities. At gatherings, bonnets sparked conversations, much like jewelry or gowns. Each style reflected cultural influences, class identity, and the artistry of millinery shops. The bonnet was a bridge between fashion and society, a wearable piece of Victorian history. To move on to the rest of the doll's design, it was very popular at this time for bonnets to be paired with a short cape or capelet. The heavy cloak worn by the doll is lavishly embroidered and tasseled, and segments into a longer cloak portion, a shorter capelet on top, and then a wide hood that reveals a finely crafted lace blouse underneath. The dresses of Victorian women were often long and covered the ankles, as it would have been seen as indecent to not do so. Younger girls were the only ones who would be accepted by society to wear any kind of shorter dresses. On her torso, the doll wears a long-lined boned corset, and under her skirt appears to be a lace-hemmed petticoat that provides body and shape to her overskirt. This style of dress gives the doll a sense of youth, as she is described in the game descriptions to perhaps be a thrown out and used dress-up doll. And there might even be a little bit of an uncomfortable underlying connotation based on her origins as Grimaud's creation. And then lastly, and maybe most importantly, the doll is wearing a pair of striking red lace gloves and a red cravat-styled neckerchief, which invokes imagery of the main theme of the game, blood. The next design that we're going to be discussing today is that of Adela, nun of the Healing Church. Adela is wearing what we can assume to be the standard nun outfit for the Healing Church. Most of the outfit is black cloth and all of the white parts have been bloodied. There are a couple story implications for maybe why these parts are bloodied, but I will not be going over that today. The long cowled robe-like dress that Adela is wearing is quite reminiscent of European nun habits and monastic garb in the Middle Ages, loosely from around the 15th to 18th centuries. And then with Josefka, we have a very similar, actually identical design to Adela's long cowled robe, with the same medieval European influences from nuns and hospitallers, just in a dirtied white color scheme instead. It is unfortunately impossible to get Josefska's armor set in-game, so we don't have much more information than this. The next design is Walter, Master of the League. Walter is wearing the Constable armor set with the Master's iron helm on his head. As we can learn from item descriptions in the game, this iron helm is passed down from master to master of the League. Interestingly, the Constable armor set is said to be worn by foreigners not from Yarnum. Compared to the more Victorian gentleman-style designs of the Hunter, Walter's design stylistically resembles French and just widely European officers in the late 1700s. We can see many officers with dark blue thigh-length coats, large ornate golden buttons, and white gloves. And there are some later examples worn during the American Civil War of greatcoats similar to the one worn by Walter. I would say that Walter's jacket also resembles the English bluecoat style. This kind of uniform originated from the garb of foundlings housed at the Christ Hospital Charity School in 16th century England. The school uniform consisted of belted, long blue coats, knee breeches, yellow socks, and bands at the neck. These jackets were referred to as housey coats by the students and were often adorned by large buttons. This style of buttoned blue coat is very similar to the one worn by Walter in my opinion. So both of the kind of stylistically similar examples that I could find in history kind of form a institutional and powerful narrative behind Walter's dress code. And if we look a little bit later in the Georgian era, we can see that Walter's cane and button jacket also kind of evokes imagery of kind of like Regency era in the mid to late 1800s as well. Generally, we can just come to the consensus that this kind of fashion style was popular among men for a long period of time. And this is the same period in which I feel most of the designs in Bloodborne and Walter are influenced by. The next design is that of Master Willem. Master Willem was the head of the respected Bergenworth College, and he is dressed in very fine robes to go along with that. The metal coverings on Willem's eyes perhaps are referencing his insight on eldritch wisdom, and maybe showing that he cares more for internal insight than the actual literal eyesight. The clothing chosen for Master Willem resembles ecclesiastical costumes, especially ornate examples from 16th century German popes, cardinals, and bishops. And these designs themselves were influenced by ornate Franco-Byzantine clergy in the 5th to 11th centuries. Willem's garb consists of an ornate white roche, golden and blue pluvial cope, and a seemingly matching blue stole trailing off the sides of his body. And atop his head is a mitre hat, which was the traditional ceremonial headdress of bishops and certain abbots in traditional Christianity. The next design is of Yuri, the Last Scholar. Yuri is wearing the choir set, in which game descriptions explain that this means she is a high-ranking member of the Healing Church, and that she is a scholar who desires to continue the work of Bergenworth College. Similarly to Master Willem, Yuri is also wearing a pair of metal eye coverings. The robe that she is wearing resembles the distinctly non-trailing belted robes worn by upper-class civilians in the 12th and 13th centuries, which were usually adorned with a cloak on top, and in this case also a capelet. It also resembles the cowled robes worn by members of religious sects in the Middle Ages as well, and bears a striking resemblance to clergy choir habits. And then the black cloth in the middle kind of resembles that of a scapular in my opinion. I am not an expert when it comes to high or runway fashion. My interest lies more in historical fashion, but there is a notable resemblance between some of the works of designer Alexander McQueen and that of the designs of Bloodborne. The choir set in particular shares a similar hat mask design and flow in the sleeves to this piece from Alexander McQueen's 2002 Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious collection. And then we can see some more design parallels between the dress of Yharnam's Undead Queen and Alexander McQueen's 2004 fall collection, The Night's Queen. This piece from the collection shares a similar structure and overall ghostly texture to Queen Yharnam's bloodstained gown. And the back of Queen Yharnam's wedding-esque gown is elevated and supported by a bustle. Popular in the 1800s, bustles are a foundational undergarment, usually a piece of padded fabric or even sometimes a structured cage that supported the large and heavy frills at the back of a woman's skirt and added volume and fullness. And then around her neck is a piece of cloth called a ruff. A ruff collar was typically crafted from linen fabrics and then starched for added structure and rigidity. It was commonly worn throughout Europe from the mid-16th century to the mid-17th centuries by royals and society's elites. This is evidently an incredibly fitting piece for the Queen of Yharnam herself and suits her position perfectly from a historical standpoint. I don't want to spend too much time on this next character, but I will quickly mention some details about younger Madara's twin. His attire is incredibly bloodied and resembles butcher clothing with a large apron. Notably though, his hat resembles a capirote hat, which was a pointed hat symbolizing humility and penance, often worn by those receiving religious punishment, a symbol for their shame and public atonement, and also a way to become closer to God. Moving on now to our next design of Eileen the Crow. Eileen's design has always really stood out to me personally. The construction is similar to that of the other hunters, mixed with some of the militant motifs from Valter. But I think it really holds its own identity, and no other character feels so unique as Eileen does. Eileen's outfit takes the historical depictions of crow-like bubonic plague doctors and makes it into something almost kind of couture, something that I could imagine Alexander McQueen, for example, would design. This beak that we see on historical depictions of plague doctors in the 1700s was said to be filled with aromatic herbs and spices like lavender, myrrh, and cinnamon to ward off the miasma of sickness from their patients. Eileen is a disillusioned hunter that is claimed to no longer dream, and has taken it upon herself to handle the out-of-control hunters. Blood madness can be induced by merely the smell of blood, and like our real-world plague doctors, her beak mask contains incense to ward off the madness. Modern depictions of the plague doctor are often quite gothic in nature, and they're usually paired with steampunk designs, and I think this has definitely influenced Eileen's approach to style. Her unique hunter's capelet expands into a frayed mess of torn fabrics resembling dark bird feathers. And this design really complements the darkly clothed stereotypical plague doctor depictions from our modern times. When designing Eileen, I believe that the team really took the original historical concepts and then the evolved modern interpretations of those said concepts and combined the two to make Eileen's design. I always find it really interesting how historical garments actually changed over time and how they're remembered because of modern interpretations of the pieces. Next up, I want to quickly discuss the bigoted / narrow-minded old man. So the narrow-minded old man is wearing the sweaty clothes set, and it is a pretty standard 19th, 20th century men's outfit. This is another design that feels quite Dickensian in nature, and it really reveals the poverty and struggle of life in Yarnum. The garb consists of a ragged and somewhat unstructured hat, a sullied cotton or linen white undershirt, paired with a woolen waistcoat and tailored trousers with a formal front pleated crease. And on his feet is a pair of muddied derby shoes. This is by far the most realistic look of poverty and struggle that we get not only of Yarnum, but also the real people from this time period that they took inspirations from. The average not wealthy person living in Victorian England would have probably been dressed very similar to this, mud and all. The next character is Edgar, Choir Intelligencer. Edgar is wearing the student set, which is the uniform of the bygone Bergenwent College, which is the place in which the Healing Church grew from. The student set is a quite standard Georgian and Victorian ensemble. Edgar wears a brown waistcoat seemingly made from a tweed sort of fabric, and then his thin woolen coat interestingly lacks sleeves. Underneath this is a white, presumably cotton shirt with a subtle tie at the base of the neck. His trousers and shoes are also quite standard for menswear in the late 1700s and 1800s, and reminds me greatly of a little bit more of an elevated version of what the narrow-minded old man wears. And also, like the sweaty clothes, this is definitely one of the more tame and historically accurate depictions of Victorian fashion in Bloodborne. In similar fashion to Edgar, Mikolash, host of the Nightmare, also wears the student set. His particular version has a cape and features an academic-styled robe. And on his head is a mensis cage, an iron-barred helm that is said to better connect the wearer with the Great Ones. And with that is the very last character we will be discussing today. If you are interested in even more historical video game fashion or want to support the channel, you can check out my Patreon and channel memberships. I really love Victorian fashion. It is like the era right before our modern world, kind of. I find it a really interesting era to talk about because while it is quite far removed from our time and we dress quite different now, it is not nearly as far removed as like medieval times, the 1500s. And honestly, if you wanted to emulate that style today, there are many pieces that are still loosely socially acceptable today. As always, I love discussing the fashion with you guys, so feel free to leave a comment below which Bloodborne design is your favorite and why. It is always my goal in every video to be clear and informational, so I hope you are able to walk away from today's video learning something that maybe you didn't know before. I would like to say a quick thank you to my friend Daniel, in which this video would not have been possible without his help. He has played Bloodborne many more times than I have, and his advice was instrumental in the creation of this video. Thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.